Morning or good morning or good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Welcome to the panel discussion on the topic of India's G20 meetings in Kashmir, camouflaging settler colonialism. Many of us are going to be speaking to you from Turtle Island North, and I would first like to begin by acknowledging that I'm located on unceded indigenous territory of the Gani and Gahaka Nation, a place which has long been a site of meeting and exchange among many indigenous peoples and First Nations. I'm committed to reconciliation and supporting indigenous-led efforts for decolonization. As you can see from the screen box, my name is Dolores Chu, and I've been involved in solidarity and support work for a long time. A few ground rules. We're asking everyone to keep your mics on mute. We have a Q&A feature, and anybody can post questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And our moderator will include your questions that you pose there in his questions. So a little contextualization and background to the event today. The Intergovernmental Forum, the G20, is being hosted by India, its current president. As the 19 member countries and various other stakeholders come together to discuss important issues of global economy, sustainable development, and climate change, India's role as a host has raised many questions. This expert panel will examine, my screen sort of just went blank, so I'm just going to my printed script. This expert panel will examine the controversial issue of hosting G20 meetings in an internationally disputed region of Kashmir. Kashmir is subject to settler colonialism, forced and illegal demographic change, expropriation of land, economic extraction, and environmental and ecological degradation by the Indian state. With the Indian state busy in projecting a false normalcy in Kashmir, the reality of everyday Kashmiris subject to gross human rights violations is going unnoticed. The silencing of Kashmiris, particularly suppression of the work of journalists and human rights defenders, and illegal detention and persecution of ordinary Kashmiris must be centered as important nations come together to validate India's G20 presidency. The speakers will in particular speak to reasons for boycotting G20 meetings in Kashmir. And we will be inviting you to take other actions connected with the theme of today's gathering. We'll be putting some of this information in chat, writing letters and other relevant resources. At this point, though, we'd like to acknowledge the very many groups that have come together to co-sponsor this event, underlining the urgency and importance of this work. Okay? So almost 30 organizations: Academics for Palestine Concordia, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir, Centre d'études sur l'Asie du Sud, South Asia Forum, Code Pink, Critical Diasporic South Asian Feminisms Collective, Free Kashmiri Political Prisoners, Friends of Sabil North America, or FOSNA, India Solidarity Germany, Munich, International Defenders Council, International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India, INSAF India, Just Peace Advocates, Justice for All Canada, Kashmir Law and Justice Project, Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network, Kashmir Palestine Scholars Solidarity Network, leftwingbooks.net, Palestinian and Jewish Unity or PAJU, People's Health Movement United States, Projet Accompagnement Solidarité Colombie or PISAC or PASC, Punjabi Literary and Cultural Association Winnipeg, Quebec Public Interest Research Group, or CUPA Concordia, South Asia Solidarity Group, South Asian Diaspora Action Collective, SADAC, Stand with Kashmir, the Polis Project, University Network for Human Rights, and World Beyond War. Okay. We will now screen a short documentary of under 10 minutes on the current situation in Kashmir before we begin the panel. The documentary is called Lines of Control, and it's about the conflict in Kashmir and provides a snapshot of the history and the situation on the ground. Some of the images perhaps may be disturbing, so we ask you to do what you need to take care of yourself. Okay? So the documentary, please.
Kashmir is a region between India and Pakistan, and part of it is also occupied by China. Kashmir is one of the worst humanitarian crises that the world faces in the current moment. It's a nuclear flashpoint, and that's what we need to understand. It's 8 million people who have been under direct military occupation from India since 1947. What we also see is the exacerbation that happens because of the Hindu nationalist and the supremacist government that has been in power for the last 6-7 years. And from 2019 onwards, what we have watched is Kashmiris completely being dispossessed by settler colonialism that India has put into action. What we see in Kashmir is not only the physical killings and maimings and incarcerations. What we also see is the actual killing of people's aspirations for their own self-determination, which has been promised to them by the international community, especially the United Nations.
In 2019, the Indian government unilaterally revoked 2 very critical articles, Article 35A and Article 370, maintained Kashmir's autonomous status in the Indian Union. Even though there had been decades of repression before, since 2019, the repressive apparatus of the Indian state became even more intense. And because of that, certain laws were passed to further criminalize freedom of expression, press freedom. Activists and artists and scholars, a whole slew of people were arrested under draconian laws, colonial era laws, and held in prison without trial, without even knowing what they were charged for. Soon after the abrogation happened, what India did was enforce massive communication blackouts in Kashmir. So people had no access to the internet, they had no access to the media, they had no access to television or phone lines. That just created sort of a blanket of silence over the region for many months on end.
Kashmir was historically a distinct region in the Himalayas, a people with their own distinct sense of self, their own identity, who interacted with the outside world, but on their own terms. They saw Kashmir as their homeland. For them, Kashmir was Mulki Kashmir, or the country of Kashmir. For most of its history, Kashmir had remained an independent realm. From time to time, it had come under foreign control. In 1846, the British East India Company sold Kashmir to the Dogras for 75 lakh rupees, a few shawl goats and some shawls, which was around 6.5 million pounds sterling in British currency terms of the time. And in 1947, when the British left the subcontinent, Kashmiris were still fighting for their own freedom from the Dogra regime. They were almost successful, but as a parting shot, the Dogra ruler, facing protests from Kashmiris, his own subjects, escaped Kashmir and signed a treaty of accession with India, practically inviting the Indian forces to come and annex Kashmir on his behalf. India invaded Kashmir and took over as its own territory. It claimed that Kashmir had been part of India, which was absolutely not true. This annexation kind of became consolidated into a military occupation. The Indian government imposed new laws, new rules on Kashmiri life, turning Kashmir into a colonial backyard of its new emerging empire. Kashmiris eventually lost this opportunity in 1947 to regain their own freedom and independence. By November, Jammu's Muslim population was basically being told to leave or face death. In one instance, people were being loaded onto buses, but instead of sending them towards the border with Pakistan, they were actually misdirected towards the forest, where they were killed then. This ethnic cleansing in Jammu, which became known as Jammu Massacre, according to news reports published in Britain at that time, close to 237,000 Muslims from Jammu had not reached their refugee camps across Pakistan. They were unaccounted for and were presumed to be dead.
There are three nation-states, nuclear powers, China, India, and Pakistan, all of which exert their territorial claims over Kashmir. India claims Kashmir in its entirety based on a provisional accession that was signed between the Hindu king, an unrepresentative ruler, and India. Pakistan claims Kashmir because of its predominantly Muslim population and calls it its jugular vein. China claims the Askaichen region of this territory, which is a very important region, but an arid one that lies between Tibet and Xinjiang. What also makes it very critical is the fact that Kashmir has ample water resources, primarily its rivers, that both India and Pakistan draw most of their electricity and their irrigation water from. The other very important element in all of this is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, a $50+ billion investment that is supposed to connect the Gwadar port in Pakistan with the Xinjiang area in China, and that runs through Gilgit-Baltistan, which is also part of the disputed Pakistani-administered Kashmiri territory. And that's what makes this area deeply strategic. There have been 3 major border wars between India and Pakistan over the status of Kashmir, and there's been 1 war between China and India already in the 1960s. But apart from that, what tends to happen is on a day-to-day basis, there are border clashes that are called skirmishes. But those skirmishes or those border clashes have dramatically shaped the lives of communities that live along the line of control, the disputed line of control between India and Pakistan.
Imagine living in Kashmir in a state of siege, where you cannot voice your political aspirations, where you cannot move about freely, where you have checkpoints all around you, where you have no basic amenities, where law doesn't work. Law is a state of order rather than an ideal of justice. So what you see is a rise in mental health issues. You see a rise in depression, you see rise in suicide rates, and what you also see is rise in substance abuse amongst youth. 1 in 7 Kashmiris have either witnessed torture or have been subject to torture. And if we look at the killings, more than 100,000 people, both combatants and non-combatants, have been killed thus far by the Indian government forces, as well as the militia and the vigilantes that are also rampant in the region. Kashmir is the case of world's first mass blindings that have occurred because of the use of pellet shotguns that the Indian government has used on protests. This interview could not be held in Kashmir, because Kashmiris cannot speak about the human rights abuses, they cannot speak about their civil liberties being curbed and suppressed, they cannot talk about their political aspirations being completely repressed. This humanitarian crisis is caused by something, and that is because people are asking for their political rights. They're demanding that the UN resolutions be fulfilled, and that's what India doesn't like. So the human rights abuses are not occurring in a vacuum. They're occurring as a result of people asking for their rights.
We need to turn Kashmir into a bridge of peace rather than the point of conflict that it has become. Kashmir belongs to the people of Kashmir, and they should be the ones to determine their own future. For that to happen, the United Nations Security Council needs to fulfill its own mandate. It needs to enact its own resolutions which called for the right to self-determination in Kashmir. If you want to help, you should sign our petition here. What's next in this documentary is that you can ask questions, learn about Kashmir and its people. You can also explore the interactive map and learn about the military occupation in the region and about the critical events that have unfolded in Kashmir over the recent years. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now move on. I'm going to pass the baton on to my colleague on the panel, Dean Accardi, who's going to moderate the discussion that follows. Dean Accardi is an assistant professor of history at Connecticut College. He is a historian of gender and religion in South Asia. His research re-examines notions of mutually exclusive religions, hybridity, and syncretism, reconceptualizes relationships between religions and other social phenomena, and highlights how historical and religious narratives reconstruct the past to serve socio-political agendas. Dean's current book project, An Ascetic Body Politic, examines depictions of asceticism in histories and hagiographies of 16th century Kashmir, and analyzes how bodily practices of saints like Lal Ded and Nand Rishi were used to shape ideas of gender, sainthood, and sovereignty. So, Dean, it's yours now.
Thank you, Dolores, and thank you for that incredible introduction. And I'm very proud of my colleagues who have crafted such an excellent documentary on the current situation in Kashmir. Thank you all for coming today. I hope we have a robust conversation. We have three keynote guests here. First is Robert Fontina. He is an author and journalist working for peace and social justice and writing extensively about US foreign policy in the Middle East. His most recent book is Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. Additionally, he serves on the boards of World Beyond War, an organization that seeks to end all current wars and prevent future ones, Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, and Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir. He is the co-host of the podcast Geopolitics, Exploring Myth and Realities. Next, we have Anam Zakaria. She is an award-winning author and freelance journalist who writes frequently about violence, memory, narrative making, and the construction of the other. She has authored Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan-Administered Kashmir, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, CBC, and the Toronto Star, as well as several South Asian media outlets. Third, Athar Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. Athar is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which won the 2020 Gloria Anzaldúa Honorable Mention Award, the 2021 Public Anthropologist Award, and Advocate of the Year Award in 2021. She has been featured in the Feminist 2021, a list of 100 women from the Global South working on critical issues. She is the co-author of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak?, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She has published a poetry collection titled The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming. Athar's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the co-founder of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Athar is also co-editor of Cultural Anthropology. So to begin our panel, we will first have each of our panelists give a 5 to 7 minute opening remarks, and then I will come back with follow-up questions. And if you from the audience would like me to include some of your questions to the panelists, please add it to the Q&A, and we will hopefully be able to get to your questions. So first, we'll turn to Robert Fontina.
Good day, and thank you. It's a privilege for me to be part of today's panel. While few of the world's governments seem to care about Palestine, at least their officials will occasionally pay lip service to the extreme violations of human rights and international law that the apartheid regime of Israel commits against the people of Palestine on a daily basis. Sometimes, following a particularly egregious crime, there will even be some news coverage about it. But generally, the myth of Israel as a democratic state is declared, although few outside of profit and power-motivated governmental leaders believe it. Yet for the Kashmiris, even this limited attention is not granted, despite the fact that the brutal settler colonial project that India is perpetrating on the Kashmiris equals, if not exceeds, that of Israel's on Palestine. Zionist beliefs in Jewish superiority parallel Hindutva beliefs in Indian superiority, and India is following the Israeli model. There can be no doubt that India is a settler colonial nation, with Kashmir as its victim. Settler colonialism differs from colonialism, the goal of which is to dominate an indigenous majority to fulfill the interests of the dominating nation at the expense of the nation being colonized. With settler colonialism, the goal is to permanently occupy the nation or territory being colonized. Since the abrogation of Article 370, thousands of Indians have moved into Kashmir, taking control by force of administrative positions in all areas that were once held by Kashmiris. Once prevented from purchasing land in Kashmir, Indians are now free to do so and are taking full advantage of that. The goal of settler colonialism is to establish a new state on someone else's land. How is India accomplishing this? On November 16th of 2019, 3 months after the abrogation of Article 370, Sandeep Chakravorty, India's Consul General to New York City, was in New York attending a private event, and he clearly outlined the plan. He told Kashmiri Hindus and Indian nationals that India will build settlements in Kashmir modeled after Israel. He said, quote, "I believe you will be able to go back and you'll be able to find security because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. If the Israeli people can do it, we can also do it," close quote. Several international human rights groups have documented how Israel is an apartheid regime, yet the same behaviors are being perpetrated on the Kashmiris by India, and yet the same level of criticism is not leveled toward that country. Time does not allow me to detail all the ways in which the brutal racist regimes of Israel and India are similar, but I will discuss a few of them. Articles 1, 55, 56, and 73 of the United Nations Charter guarantee the right of self-determination of all peoples. But that is not the only international agreement guaranteeing this right. The Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights all guarantee self-determination. More specifically, United Nations Resolution 47, Article 7 states the following, quote, "The government of India should undertake that there will be established in Jammu and Kashmir a plebiscite administration to hold a plebiscite as soon as possible on the question of the accession of the state of India, to India or Pakistan," close quote. The people of Kashmir have been waiting for this right to be granted to them for 3/4 of a century. Another right is enshrined in Article 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states the following, quote, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile," close quote. This right is violated by India and Israel on a daily basis. Israel has a policy called administrative detention, enabling Palestinians to be incarcerated for long periods of time without charge and without access to counsel. In India, the Public Safety Act allows detention for a year without trial and without charges being laid. However, many prisoners released after 1 year are immediately arrested again as soon as they leave the police station. These subsequent arrests can occur multiple times. There is no limit. So a Kashmiri can basically receive a life sentence and never be charged with a crime. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act provides the so-called security sector of India almost unlimited powers to arrest and kill any Kashmiri suspected of insurgency. The property of insurgents, who could better be described as freedom fighters, can be destroyed. No trial is required. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act allows soldiers and members of the police to act as judge, juries, and executioners. This is a role they seem to fulfill with pleasure. I will again draw your attention to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 19 states the following, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers," close quote. In Israel, Palestinians can be imprisoned for simply writing poetry and posting it to social media. Anti-Zionist Jews who speak against the regime are threatened and beaten by soldiers. Reporters in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem are threatened, harassed, and killed by Israeli soldiers. The situation in Kashmir is similar. 1 year after the abrogation, laws made public gatherings dangerous for any participants, and nearly 4,000 people had been arrested within that 1 year, accused of throwing stones or being miscreants. These actions were part of the Safety Act, a Public Safety Act I mentioned earlier. Additionally, political leaders were arrested and denied access to the Kashmiris who are seeking freedom. Journalist Misbah Reshi, writing for the Leaflet on September 18, 2020, just a year after the Indian abrogation of Article 370, said this, quote, "On June 2nd, the Jammu and Kashmir administration, this is the Indian administration, approved a new media policy titled Media Policy 2020 in order to ensure a synchronized and effective use of all forms of media and to build public trust and foster a genuinely positive image of the government of India and strengthen the relationship with key stakeholders," close quote. When an avowedly racist government sets media policy, there can be no freedom of the press or free speech. And now India seeks to present an all-is-well vision of the situation in Kashmir to members of the G20. Government leaders who attend will stay in luxury hotels and eat the finest food. They will see a sanitized version of Kashmir, much like many government leaders who are treated to expensive vacations in Israel only see what Israel wants them to see. People attending the G20 meetings in Kashmir will not see the many political prisoners, including children. They will not see the people expelled from their jobs to be replaced by Indians. In no way will they witness the ongoing violence perpetrated on the men, women, and children of Kashmir. Their motorcades will not take them past burned buildings where Indian forces shot and killed innocent people. They will see no protests since protest leaders have been killed or incarcerated, and the fear of attending a public gathering to protest the repressive Indian regime is so great since so many Kashmiris have seen loved ones die or be arrested for peaceful protests. Yes, foreign leaders will praise India for its work in Kashmir, ignoring the reality that India will not let them see. Since profits, power, and adulation are more important for most government officials than human rights and international law, and since they seem willing to overlook abject suffering, we must speak for those who are voiceless. As journalists, human rights activists, and others in Kashmir are silenced, we must raise our voices so they will be heard. It is a moral obligation. The people of Kashmir are relying on us. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now I would like us to turn to Anam Zakaria with her opening comments.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dean, fellow panelists, Robert and Athar, all the groups, collectives, and organizations who have made today's event possible. I'm really honored to be on this panel. My focus today is going to be on narrative making, on the construction, the curation, and the crafting of narratives that are perpetuated by the Indian state to camouflage settler colonialism in Kashmir, legitimate its occupation, and repeatedly enact violence on Kashmiri bodies. I think that narrative making is an essential part of any settler colonial project, and likewise has been central to India's settler colonial project in Kashmir too. I also think that hosting the G20 summit itself in Kashmir is central to this narrative making. The planned meetings are themselves another effort to further India's narratives, or rather myth making, about Kashmir and Kashmiris to the larger world. That until recently, there was minimal reluctance or resistance to attend the summit by members shows that the optics, the illusions, the mirages that India tries to project are to quite an extent very successful. These planned meetings in the coming days are only meant to further normalize and cement the settler colonial project. Many of us in the room today are familiar, very, very familiar with the narratives that circulate on Kashmir, about Kashmir. These are narratives of quote unquote development, narratives of progress, narratives of modernity, narratives of normalcy. These neoliberal notions of progress, of development, of modernity are used to provide a moral cover to India's policies, enabling an inscription of violence with impunity. This project is neither new, of course, nor simple enough to dissect in its entirety today. Multiple structures, tools, and techniques from Bollywood to mainstream media to smart policing are deployed in the myth-making about Kashmir and Kashmiris. For today's conversation, I'll just touch upon three techniques. The first is the weaponization of politically charged language. Kashmir has long been framed as a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, and further as Pakistan's state-sponsored terrorism. Now, in the context of rising Islamophobia post 9/11, the use of words, the deployment of words like terrorism, fundamentalism, radicalization, to refer to Kashmiris fighting for their rights and freedom are done consciously, deliberately, and convincingly. The evoking of this language is meant to, and indeed serves to, depoliticize and delegitimize the movement. Once Kashmiris are labeled as Islamic terrorists, a dehumanization begins to unfold, reinforcing Islamophobic tropes already percolating in the West, turning the violence on its head, and presenting Indian secularism and democracy as a victim of terrorism. Any reaction by India, any kind of oppression by India, then thereby gets justified. Secondly, by framing it as a bilateral issue, Kashmir is reduced to a bilateral spat between India and Pakistan. Efforts are made to draw false equivalencies or claim a higher moral ground. In particular, there's a weaponization of very, very real and very grievous issues in Balochistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir to instrumentalize, neutralize, trivialize, and legitimate violence by the Indian state on Kashmir, in Kashmir and on Kashmiris. My own work, which focuses on stories of men, women, and children living by the LOC, the line of control, in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, highlighting their grievances and struggle, is often distorted, capitalized upon by Indian media to claim how much better off Kashmiris are in Indian-occupied Kashmir. The juxtaposition with Pakistan is used by India to define itself as everything Pakistan is not, both in the Indian imaginary, but also the global imaginary. If Pakistan emerges as fundamentalist, authoritarian, and backwards in this imaginary, then India is portrayed as shining, the world's largest democracy, tolerant, pluralistic, the land of yoga, Gandhian nonviolence, peace, and so on. One story I co-wrote with fellow journalists about sexual violence experienced by women and girls hiding in bunkers to save themselves from Indian firing on the line of control was reduced to headlines like Jammu and Kashmir women become role models, their counterparts in POK, that's Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and China struggle to survive. Thirdly, what allows the Indian narrative on Kashmir to permeate both nationally and to global audiences is the arrest and torture of Kashmiri political activists, human rights defenders, and journalists, effectively silencing Kashmiri voices and replacing them with distorted and false narratives of development, progress, and very relevant to today's discussion, of course, is tourism. That the meetings being held in Srinagar are focused on tourism is no coincidence. The reported efforts to beautify, sanitize, and purify Kashmir, all through even more heightened security and militarization, and commodify, commercialize, and sell Kashmir as a pristine and exotic tourism hub is not lost. Inviting tourists to a land colonized and occupied, presenting it as a utopian landscape that India has returned tranquility, modernity, and Hindu civilization to, making it palatable for international audiences, capitalizing upon religious tourism, and instrumentalizing the summit to bring investments to Kashmir that Kashmiris will only be exploited, rather benefit from, are all an extension of the settler colonial project. The theme of India's G20 presidency claims to focus on striving for just and equitable futures in harmony with the ecosystem, emphasizing an inclusive and developed India, with a human-centric approach at its core. India has long claimed that through the abrogation of Article 370, through the domicile law, through other neoliberal ventures, Kashmir would quote unquote limp back to normalcy. The beautification of Kashmir, the arrest and repression of Kashmiris, the hosting of the G20 summit is meant to serve as a garb, as a facade, as an illusion of this quote unquote normalcy. I'll end by saying that there are many reports, there are many facts, there are many statistics and accounts out there already, written and published by Kashmiris at great risk to their lives and to their security to bust these very myths, these very narratives. We saw the documentary earlier today, and Athar, of course, spoke about the challenges of doing this kind of work, doing these kind of interviews from Kashmir, from the ground, and what that can mean. There's enough material out there. The reality is not hidden unless we want it to remain hidden. This then is a moment of reflection for the international community. What are you becoming a part of? What are you endorsing? What are you becoming and long have been complicit in? And for places like Canada and the US, where I know many people have collected today, that have their own violent relationships with their own indigenous populations, I also ask, how do your policies in and outside of home further legitimate violence on indigenous bodies? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anam. And third, and certainly not least, Athar Zia, we can have your opening comments. Before we turn to you, though, I just want to remind audience members that there should be a Q&A button option at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for our panelists, please put them there. Okay, thank you. Athar, please.
Thank you so much, Dean, and thank you to the organizers. And I think we have laid quite a good roadmap for the audience, and when this will be circulated to the broader viewership about why Kashmir is a settler colonial issue and also what exactly is happening. And I have a few things that I want to touch upon, but before anything, I do want to kind of bring focus to G20, the boycott, that the protests that are being collectively done against what's happening. A lot of people think about development and G20 and economic order and all of that. But why is it that Kashmiris are protesting G20? Is it that there's they have a regressive gene of some kind? So that's something that we do want to talk about, that G20 in Kashmir is equivalent to building a fountain in a burning house. And the Kashmir is burning at the moment. Dissent is the juice of democracy. And if you have no dissent, if you have this dead, silent population, the world community needs to ask, why is Kashmir so silent at the moment? And I think as part of the international community, as part of the global community, which is keeping an eye on these issues, we need to ask that question, because this is enforced normalcy on Kashmir. As the G20 is happening, as these delegates are going to move from the airport to these places which are curated, and now they're actually changing the places and they're beautifying, as the aesthetics of Kashmir, beautifying an open air prison. That's what they're doing at the moment. So we need to think, how is this G20 going to operate? And we also know that some of the countries are downsizing their representation, including Saudi Arabia and all of that. That's still evolving. But we need to ask, how are Kashmiris being treated as this G20 is unfolding? Schools are being closed. There is heightened surveillance. I don't want to call it security, because it's not Kashmiris being secure, because they're totally unsecure. But the Indian military, government forces, they're ensuring to choking people's normal lives. There are cordons, there are house arrests technically, and there are informal curfews where neighborhoods are cordoned so that these delegates can pass from one place to another. So it's basically this G20 summit, the huddle, being held in a place where the rest of the population is completely repressed. They're silent. Most of them are under house arrest around these areas. So that's something that we need to consider, that how is it possible that such an event is going to happen and no one is going to talk about it? So that was just kind of sensorially bringing to light to the audience that don't know Kashmir, that don't know the checkpoints, that don't know how much settler colonialism or the occupation has been imposing on Kashmir, not just from 2019 onwards, from when brazen settler colonialism on steroids is happening, but colonialism new imperialism, which has been imposed on Kashmir from 1947 onwards. So the three things that I wanted to touch upon was normalization of occupation and weaponization of democracy. Anam already laid out this very beautiful scenario that the world community continues to uphold when they think about India, although it's changing now, thinking about ahimsa, nonviolence, and yoga. But when it comes to Kashmiri perspective, which has been completely ignored, subsumed in the last 75 years, it has been a situation of colonialism. It has been a situation of Indian occupation upon Kashmiri people. There's a lot of history that we can talk about, how it becomes a settler colonial issue or how it was an occupation right from the get-go. Maybe we can do that in Q&A. I kind of want to turn towards thinking about democracy, because when we think about India, we think about this largest democracy in Asia. But does it look like democracy to Kashmiris? Has it been a democracy for Kashmiris? And why is it not? So the first and foremost is that India always upholds the idea of elections, which is a very symbolic way of portraying democracy, the Westphalian Eurocentric democracy, which is not working anywhere in the non-West. So that's something in Kashmir, which was imposed from, let's say, 1947 and 1951. The elections were imposed on Kashmir by India for the entire Kashmir, including the Pakistan administered Kashmir, which is Azad Kashmir for all practical purposes, because those people liberated themselves from the role of the Dogra ruler, which Muhammad Junaid earlier talked about. So what happens in 1951 is India wants to do elections inside the territory it is occupying. And UN and Pakistan also lodges its complaint saying that you cannot hold elections in a disputed territory. And it's the case of sub judice. But what India says is that we have to do governance. So these elections are for governance. And that is the moment when illicit elections, these are not legally bound elections. These are illicit elections that have been held inside Kashmir. And for Kashmiris, they have taken part in elections, and which has also been part of the client politician process that has taken place inside Kashmir. Because from the get-go, you had a lot of client politicians that were carrying India's water inside Kashmir. And those are the ones who are taking part in elections. And then it's very clear for people that there is an election that's held for governance, but there is politics of azadi and independence. And that's very clear in Kashmiris' minds that we have to have, the bijli, sadak, pani, we have to have shelter, water, and roads and all of that through the governance. And all disputed territory can be governed. That is in the international law. So that's what's been happening. But elections have never been an endorsement for Indian rule over Kashmir. And that's something that we have to understand as an international community, that what's happening inside Kashmir is not democracy. Even the Westphalian Eurocentric democracy, which is a completely problematic model for non-West, and is form of a neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism, which India itself is suffering. So for that matter, what's happening inside Kashmir is politics of democracy. It's a weaponization of democratic symbols. And elections is one big symbol that has been used to whitewash the occupation of Kashmir, which is nothing but a military-industrial complex occupying Kashmir through direct and indirect military aggression. There has been a lot of indirect aggression that India has imposed on Kashmiri bodies, which it gets away till 1989. And after 1989, when armed struggle breaks out, it completely changes how Kashmir is seen. And now I do want to speak to the idea of conflict and dispute, and how it's really different, and how we really need to narrativize that and re-narrativize that. And Anam has already talked about that, how it's been downgraded. Kashmir has been downgraded from an international dispute. It's already an international dispute, and 2019 re-internationalized it. But what we need to know is that it's a dispute between India and Pakistan. It probably might be a conflict between India and Pakistan and China, but there is no dispute in Kashmiri people's minds, and that's something we have to consider. Kashmiri people are very clear in what they want. And also, I think it's an important time for us to question, even though UN helps us, and UN has helped Kashmiris to make it portray to the rest of the world and showcase to the rest of the world that they're not a terrorism issue, they're a genuine resistance. But at the same time, UN resolutions are very limited. Can we have 19th century, 20th century solution for a 21st century problem. This is a historic problem, but at the same time, it's a 21st century problem. What do Kashmiris want? The plebiscite is either join India, either join Pakistan. Is it possible for Kashmiris in this 21st century moment to take what fleeing colonial rulers were putting on them, including their own local fleeing monarch? So I think these are questions, these are valid questions that we need to ask. How is it that we can resolve Kashmir creatively in 21st century? And it's not an intractable problem when you see it from Kashmiris' perspective, because they have been living under an occupation which was by far colonialism, new imperialism, and which has become a brazen settler colonialism on steroids from 2019 onwards. And I do want to talk about the Article 370. It was basically a Trojan horse. The only useful thing in Article 370 for Kashmiris was the 35A, because it protected their territorial sovereignty. And that's why Kashmiris held on to it. It was not as part of their loyalty to India. It was not as, because Article 370, the moment it was put into effect in 1949, it was eroded at that very moment. It was a very nominal kind of an statute that was remaining till 2019. And after 2019, the territorial sovereignty goes away with 370, which is why we see these influx of settlers and influx of new people who are taking dominion on various different reasons inside Kashmir. And most of them are these people who have either served in Kashmir or have been part of the army or have been part of the government forces or have been part of the bureaucracy, which is also one of the bulwarks of Indian occupation. So that's something that we need to consider, what's happening, not just when we think about the brazen Indian military rule, but also how democracy is being peddled, how democracy has been weaponized, and how it's used to whitewash what's done with Kashmiri people. So I do want to reiterate that it's not a conflict. It might be a dispute between India and Pakistan because they're nation states and the way they see themselves. But for Kashmiris, it's not a conflict. And I also think we have to pay attention to the fact that we cannot peddle 19th century solutions for a 21st century problem. And Kashmir is changing, the world is changing. And what we see from 2019 onwards, and even before 1947, most of the Indian organizations, especially that were preying on Kashmiri waters, they were called as New East India Company, harkening back to the British East India Company inside British India at that moment. So these companies, all these water projects, hydroelectric projects, Kashmiris called them the New East India Project. So when you see it from Kashmiri's perspective, you see a different India. You do not see the ahimsa, the yoga, and you don't see what India is globally known for. You see a settler colonial state that has preyed upon Kashmiri bodies and made them completely expendable. And that's what we see during this G20. As G20 is happening, the killings of combatants are happening. The burn, Kashmir, as Robert earlier talked about, the burning and dispossession, which has been brazenly visible because the current Hindutva supremacist government, it doesn't really care about what the rest of the world says, because the rest of the neoliberal world is not a saint in itself. So what they're doing is they're hand in glove with each other. And whatever is happening in Kashmir, that's completely fine because that's happening in Palestine. And we also saw the symbolics of the neoliberal military order when the pellet shotguns were being used in Chile in some years ago. You kind of see those, you see the layout of the military industrial complex that has the neoliberal necropolitical states. So in that context, we know why India gets a carte blanche to do what it is doing in Kashmir. And why is it able to use the ideal of development and say we have to develop Kashmir, so we have to take its autonomy, and the world is completely mum on that. But we need to know that from Kashmiri perspective, that's not development, it's mal-development, it's de-development, it's extractivism, it's ecocide. And with 600,000 people, military inside Kashmir, more than 750, with the new ones that are coming in, what we see happening inside Kashmir at the moment is ecocide. And that's another thing that is that the world community needs to consider, that it's an ecological disaster. If Kashmir is the size of, more or less the size of UK, the amount of army and the amount of territory it occupies is the size of Dallas. So that's the amount of stress that you have in this region. So it's not only in one perspective that Kashmir is imploding. It's imploding in political, intellectual, religious, cultural ways, but it's also the ecological ways in which it's imploding. So I think that's where I will end, and we'll take further question and answers if you have any. But that's where I will end. And that's the current state of repression. And I do want to say that right now, most human rights defenders and most activists and most people in Kashmir who have dared to speak are under arrest. And the people who can speak are also self-censoring. And there is disappearance of archives, people who have written about India in the last 15, 20 years, presenting its new imperial heart to the rest of the world. Those writings are being disappeared as we speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Athir. And thank you to all three panelists for your opening remarks. My first follow-up question that I have for you is that we know that India and some other governments and organizations consider the situation with Kashmir to be an internal Indian issue, or at most a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. However, this panel frames India's G20 meetings in Kashmir as camouflaging settler colonialism. Now, each of you have touched upon how the situation in Kashmir is, involving settler colonialism. But I wonder how you would respond to such people who, even some who are human rights advocates and whatnot would still go along with the framing that this is an internal issue or there are human rights violations, but this is not an example of settler colonialism. So how would you respond to somebody that would, want to continue framing it as not a settler colonialism issue? And also, how might you see particularly these G20 meetings as fitting into a settler colonial framework? And this time, let's start with Anam, if possible. Yep.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. I think the reason why it's maybe at first glance it's not kind of framed or thought of that way is again because of, as everybody has said, it's framed as an internal issue or as a bilateral issue. And I do think that the narrative is very, very compelling. It's very convincing. I think the Indian narrative, I think Indian presence in the larger kind of global stage holds weight. Right. And I think especially when you look at South Asia, it is kind of seen through the lens of these two nuclear powers, these two hegemonic powers. And Pakistan, of course, is framed as, the hub of global Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. And these two countries are seen as always going to war since 1947, multiple skirmishes, multiple, wars at the border. So it then reduces to just another India-Pakistan issue, just another, a way that Pakistan is maybe destabilizing the region. And I think that itself feeds into the global narrative of, anti-terrorism, post 9/11 policies and so forth. I think that's where it kind of gathers legitimacy. But I think it's essential to look at it as settler colonialism. And, Robert indicated just why that is so. What is settler colonialism? And I think I'll just echo that. It is a permanent occupation through ethnic cleansing. There's land grabbing involved over here. There's land seizures involved over here. There are demographic changes involved over here. There are efforts to marginalize the Muslim population further, to change the dynamics, to further disenfranchise. And this is not, again, a new project. We talked about the Jammu massacres. There's a long trajectory here, which is escalating and escalating. And as many have put it, as it's a project on steroids right now. And I think tourism, coming back to G20 and development, this notion of development, we have to realize that that's also, it's based on taking away people's land, right? You have local people who, as Athar, very powerfully put it, are living in an open prison, and you're beautifying that, and you're inviting others to a land that is occupied, right? In the name of investments and so forth. I also think, at the heart of settler colonialism, as I mentioned earlier, is this narrative making. And part of the narrative making is a dehumanization of the indigenous population. You see that wherever settler colonial projects have taken place, and the local population is seen as less civilized, as barbaric. In India, the way Kashmiri women or Muslim women also are seen as, they need to be rescued. There's need to rescue them. There's almost this burden of civilization. They need to be saved. Now, all of these are hallmarks of settler colonialism. So I think if you kind of immerse yourself in a better understanding of settler colonialism, and also understand that the Indian narrative, even within academia, those narratives are very, very dominant, and you kind of try to shift and disrupt that and access different information and listen to Kashmiri voices, I think we would all come out with a very different understanding.
Thank you, Anam. Robert, can you go next?
Yes, certainly. Anam's description was very apt and very complete. I would like to just look at one of the reasons people don't see it as settler colonialism is because I don't think they understand what settler colonialism actually is. It's a very short quotation I'm going to read from the Oxford Dictionaries, which describes or defines settler colonialism. And think about this in terms of what's happening in Kashmir. Settler colonialism is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. Essentially hegemonic in scope, settler colonialism normalizes the continuous settler occupation, exploiting lands and resources to which indigenous people have genealogical relationships. Settler colonialism includes interlocking forms of oppression, including racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. So in the close quote, in the case of Kashmir, it's not white supremacy that India is perpetuating or is operating under, but it's Hindutva, the system that says clearly that the Hindus are entitled to all the land, that anyone who isn't Hindu is not worthy of any rights in the country. But the concept of genocide and repression, we're seeing that on a regular basis in Kashmir. The normalization of the occupation, Indians are now able to move into and buy land, which they are doing certainly, and displace the Kashmiri people. So it's a permanent situation. It's one that is intended to be permanent by India. It is settler colonialism by every definition of that term. It is not an internal issue. In 1947, 1948, the United Nations said that the future of Kashmir would be decided by the Kashmiris. As Athar said earlier, the idea of any democratic action would require the voice of the people to be heard. And this is the basic concept, or one of the basic concepts that is the Kashmiris are being deprived of. There's no question that what India is doing is a settler colonialism project. It is extremely brutal. It is illegal under international law, and it must be ended.
Thank you. Athar, could you weigh in on this?
Yeah, I could just fill in a little. I think enough theoretical and examples have been given in order to kind of make it palpable how it's settler colonialism, and we talked about it earlier as well. But I do want to say one thing that might, for those people who don't know Kashmir's history or are interested in knowing, there's one important event that happens in 1947 that even Kashmiris themselves, the younger Kashmiris, not the ones who were born in 40s, 50s, 60s, the ones who were born in latter part of 70s or 80s, even they knew as what is known as the Kabaili raid, meaning the raid of the tribals. And that kind of tells you how hegemonic Indian narrative has been for the last 75 years. So I think my generation, we had, not that there was, Kashmiris have written in the last 72 years, 75 years, but that's not been read outside in the other parts of the world, and which is unfortunate, but it's also telling of how hegemonic India's narrative has been about Kashmir and how it has portrayed Kashmir. So the tribal raid was framed as hordes from the northwestern frontier province mixed with what then became with what had recently become Pakistan in that time period, had come inside Kashmir and they had been marauders of some sort. Now, I'm not saying that there was no violence, but the fact is that this was narrativized by India as a tribal raid. But when you look at it from the perspective of Kashmiris, it doesn't, what is kind of deleted is the Jammu massacre, which Muhammad Junaid talks about, which happens around that time, even before that. And then most of these people are coming to help the co-religionists who are being killed at that time. And what is also left out, that the massacre that happens in Jammu is aided and abetted by the monarch, and is also aided and abetted by the RSS, which is the militia wing of the BJP, the current ruling Hindutva, the supremacist Hindu party. So all of that gets left out. People, it's almost as if RSS had no role in that massacre. It's almost as if it had no religious element. So all of that gets kind of like labeled onto this tribal raid or the Kabyle raid. And many Kashmiris are given that history. And sadly, because Kashmiris inside Kashmir, and it's also a post-colonial malaise, that many people in Kashmir, they haven't read their own history. They don't know about their own heroes and heroines. They know about the Indian heroes. They know about world history because that's what they are taught. And the kind of education that has been given inside Kashmir from 1947 onwards is really to create a constituency for India, rather than making people politically aware and the rights and the erasure of own history. So Kashmiris had to, they had to educate themselves in this entire history that had been lost and erased. So many Kashmiris, and the other part of it is also Kashmiris who had been exiled during that time to Azad Kashmir. Their history is completely erased. They are completely ignored and subsumed. And now we have kind of like begin to see, and this has already always been known as the Holocaust of the East, the Jammu massacre, which was completely, it was completely pushed under the carpet as if it had never happened, as if Jammu province had always been dominated by the Hindu population. But 64% of Jammu was Muslim in 1947, and it became, I think, less than 40% after the massacre. And so that tells you the hegemony of Indian narrative. It takes Kashmir's history and then feeds it to them in a different form, as if Kashmiris are their own enemies. They infantilize Kashmiri population, even in this kind of like, I don't want to call it a dispute or a conflict, in the resistance that Kashmiris have stepped up, in the resistance that Kashmiris have had since 1947, and even before that. Kashmiri resistance is not 70, 75 years old. It's more than that. If you want to put a formal date, let's go to 1931, when the Dogra ruler killed 22 Kashmiris in the plaza while they were trying to do protest and prayer together. So Kashmiris have been infantilized as if they don't know their own mind, as if they don't know what they want, as if they are kind of like lost between the two countries. And that infantilization and that patriarchal nature has been kind of hegemonized by India. And tourism is also a part of that, because it's almost like, this is the only thing that's good for you. Developing all other parts of economy are seen as less useful, because tourism is going to keep Kashmiris very servile, because it's a servile kind of economy that's developed around it. And you have to be hospitable. Otherwise, you have to put a smile on your face and cater to the Indian tourists while their army and the government is killing them and is making them expendable. So I think the hegemony of Indian narrative, which is really becoming less and less in the last 15 years, which we also see how much it frustrates them. And I think that's very important for us to consider, which has narrativized this as a dispute, and now it has downgraded it to internal dispute. And I think that's the information war that has to be stepped up with all the allies and the solidarities that we have in the international community.
Thank you, Athar. One thing that I very much appreciate you were saying it, but many of you have brought this up, is this this development discourse seems to be running through all sorts of actions that India and others have been involved in Kashmir keep deploying. And even I think it's noteworthy that Indian economist Jean Drèze submitted a report in 2019 with the abrogation of 370, pointing out that In fact, the some of the laws passed under the Naya Kashmir and so on and so forth that were semi-social safety net policies made it so that the lowest end of poverty in Kashmir was in fact not as bad as Prime Minister Narendra Modi's home state of Gujarat, even though Gujarat is presented as a model of development and so on and so forth. And in some ways, Modi ran on the platform that, oh, look at Kashmir as a model. Look at Gujarat as a model. We're going to bring that model to Kashmir. Jean-André said, oh, well, if you bring that model to Kashmir, it will increase poverty, not reduce it. And we see recent economic data showing that those who were barely being held out of poverty are now descending into worse poverty. Likewise, we see that for the G20 summit, that kind of infrastructural spending in Kashmir is for beautification for non-Kashmiris. So I was wondering how you could speak to what is it that India is wanting to do with the G20 in Kashmir? What is their intention? What are they trying to get at? And you can yourself kind of jump in. Who would like to begin with this one?
What India wants to do, if I could start, is to portray everything as normal. Wants to see that, yes, there were some problems with Kashmir, but they've all been resolved now. And look how beautiful your accommodations are. And we invite tourists to come to this part of India. They want to, as Anam talked about the narrative, and they want to control the narrative and say, yes, everything is fine now, that this is part of India. It was in revolt for a time, but everything is under control now and everything is normal, and see what a wonderful thing we've done. So this is going to be very difficult for them to convey because of all the security apparatuses that they've had to put in place for the meeting. However, the idea is to present a facade of normalcy. It's going to be, as I said, very difficult, but India wants to increase its trade with the world, its reputation on the world stage, which right now should be worse than it is because of the treatment of the government towards Muslims and specifically towards Kashmiris. But in general, it's a very unjust society, and this is what the Indian government hopes will be a platform for them to discount those facts that are being seen on the world stage, or to some degree, we know that a lot of this is hidden, but they're looking for a projection of normalcy and that all is well in Kashmir, and also to kind of preclude Pakistan saying anything about Kashmir, because if everything's normal and it's part of India, what can Pakistan say? But these are all lies that's trying to tell the world, and the governmental leaders who attend, some of them are going to believe it, and that's where the danger is.
If I can jump in there, absolutely what Robert said, projecting normalcy. I'll just add that there's also very real extraction of resources that would benefit India. So there are economic aspects over here as to why it would want to do this, right? Why it would want to, quote unquote, normalize, draw in investment and so forth. I also think that we have to keep in mind that this really feeds into Indian national politics and national elections. Right? For BJP to claim to have resolved, quote unquote, the Kashmir issue, right? To have normalized it, to claim to have carried out surgical strikes in Pakistan administered Kashmir, to have targeted militant camps, all of this helps solidify its own electoral base, which often, we know what's happening across India to Muslims right now. So it also feeds into this narrative of security, of targeting the enemy, and of protecting Indians, and especially protecting dominant Hindu majority from this apparent threat. So I think we also need to keep in mind how this impacts the national political environment and what BJP is trying to do over there as well.
Athar, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I agree that I think the optics and normalization and India's own political sort of like whatever the processes are happening there. But I also want to say that it's not only in the current moment that India is trying to peddle Kashmir as this haven for tourism and trade and all of that. I might take your attention to 1983 when there was an international cricket match that was held in Kashmir. And even at that time, you had quote unquote the secular parties ruling India. And even they had this agenda to portray in every decade. This is not new, this is new because we are seeing it in our own time, and we have social media and there's so much media around, and we're seeing India in a different light propagating, and it's propaganda in a different way. To Kashmiris, most of this has happened in different phases, different times, in different ways. The degree and intensity might be different, but the 1983, the World Cup or whatever match it was between West Indies and India, it was happening. And Kashmiris actually protested by digging the pitch at that time. And there were 4 or 5 young men who later on became leaders for the resistance movement. They were the ones who dug the pitch, trying to bring the global attention to this issue, saying, how can you hold an international match in a place which is disputed? So this is a different version. It's a bigger version because India has gained a platform. India is kind of quote unquote looked upon by the world. But I think this is also unraveling of India if we see it as that. I don't really see this all going rosy for India because this is a diplomatic setback for it. To have this kind of meeting in a place which is burning, in a place which is an open air prison, and the voices of conscience are already saying that. And I think it's a big diplomatic setback. So I mean, on one hand, whereas I see the military-industrial complex, the occupation cracking down on people, but at the same time, I don't see it as a complete win for BJP, which is really invested in putting up these big spectacles of power. And that's not what the secular parties used to do. They used to be very discreet in imposing its tyranny on Kashmiri people. So that World Cup kind of makes me think. And also there are other examples where Kashmir was made as the hub of tourism, of this kind of trade, that kind of trade. Tulips, tulips are the most beautiful thing. And now tulips have been grown in Kashmir, and we have a big tulip garden there where hordes of tourists come in March, April. And it's really ironic that that tulip garden is on, part of it is like the place where you had secret prisons. You had concentration camps, so to speak, which are not really known as concentration camps because India gets away with so much human rights abuses. So yeah, I think it's part of the optics, part of normalization, part of its own geopolitics. But at the same time, I also feel like there's a long litany of what India has done in similar fashion inside India, trying to portray normalcy, but also trying to work on, the narrative that India is ours, because that's what India is saying. It's saying that it has the right to do it, which is clearly an illicit claim that it's making.
Thank you, Athar. I really appreciate you bringing up the ways in which Kashmiris themselves are involved in responding to various situations, both with the G20, but in previous occasions with digging up the pitch and whatnot. That I think it is intriguing that when we talk, or when international media talks about the Kashmir situation as either an internal issue or an international dispute or these sorts of things, that oftentimes it is brought forward as if Kashmiris aren't part of the conversation. This is like a game of chess between various, large national nuclear powers. And so I also appreciate previously where you mentioned that, like, whether, we can think about how India, Pakistan, and China regard each other, is this a dispute over Kashmir or not? There's a way in which, like, Kashmiris are erased over and over again in conversations about Kashmir. I also think it's intriguing, this term, as Robert said, everything is normal, that the G20 meetings seem to be wanting to project this idea that everything is normal in Kashmir, and this term normalcy keeps coming up over and over again. And there's a part of me that also is so frustrated with this term normalcy, because what it seems in political science talk to indicate is acquiescing to the current regime of power. That's what normalcy means, that nobody has any political will to change what the current situation is as far as power dynamics are concerned in a region. And this could be in Palestine or Kashmir or other places. And so this is, I find this intriguing in thinking about the G20 summit, that there seems to be two directions in which, advertising, so to speak, is happening for India there. One is this, saying, oh, there's no need to worry about Kashmir. Oh, some of you visitors, you may have heard about Kashmir being, one of the most dangerous places on earth. Well, we've solved it. Look, walk around. Everything is great. So therefore, you don't need to worry about things here. And so therefore, moving to the second thing, and therefore your investments are safe. And so there seems to be this secondary side of it that is, possibly courting investment opportunities from these international actors in Kashmir, now that especially Article 35A was removed, that non-Kashmiris can own land, exploit resources in Kashmir even more than was possible before. So this seems to be a kind of double play involved in India holding these G20 summits in Kashmir. And I'm wondering, along those lines, it seems like each of you has feelings about how is it that, well, I guess I should ask you, how do you think it can be conveyed to those who are participating in the G20 meetings, how we can get them to see that normal is not a good thing, that this normalcy is in fact a presentation of forced passivity and making the Kashmiri population marginalized, occupied, and so on and so forth. How is it that we can get those who are sending representatives or the representatives themselves to see that what looks on the surface as peace is not a good thing, that this is in fact indicative of a deeper problem? Does that make sense?
That's a very difficult question, and it's very challenging because these representatives are going there with the idea of trade and exploiting natural resources and so on. Their priority is not, and I can't say for all of them, but for many of the governments of the world, the priority is not human rights and international law. It's power and profits. And until the people in various countries can convince their government leaders, whether elected or appointed, that the priority should be basic human rights for people, adherence to international law, then this isn't going to change. Now, what we can do in this current situation is if those people attending these meetings decide they want to see a different part of Kashmir than they're allowed to go to, and then they're forbidden for doing so, they need to question, why is this? Why can't I, if everything's so wonderful here, why can't I travel freely around the country? They should question why they're seeing so much security from their hotel rooms. And if they can do this, then perhaps they'll begin to question the idea that what may be peaceful that they're seeing does not indicate justice by any means and needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Anam or Athar, would you like to weigh in on this? How is it that we can get either the representatives or those in countries with representatives to see that a kind of surface peace is actually a problem rather than a good thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Dean, at some level, we also have to ask the question, when we talk about normalcy for whom? Right? Who is this a normal situation for? And in many ways for the Indian state, this is a normal way of treatment of Kashmiris. This again is not necessarily new. Now, when it comes to how do we show that to other people that this is a facade, this is not normal for Kashmiris, Kashmir is burning as we speak. I think I know that there are a list of resources that are kind of being shared in the chat as well, list of steps as well. And I think all of those are very important, whether it's writing to your MP or having conversations like these, the creation of the documentary, the creation of resources. I think it's important that this burden of educating, right? It keeps falling back on Kashmiris. And I also wonder, yes, Athar rightly pointed out that there's an erasure of resources and material right now done very, consciously. But I also do think that there is material out there. There has been material out there. So when is the world going to start listening? Right? Do they want to listen? Kind of coming back to what Robert was saying. And I think that's where the biggest challenge is. Is it about producing? Is it about more knowledge production? Or is it about who wants to access that knowledge and do something about it? And I think that's an issue of power and structures and states and governments. And that's where they need to be held accountable.
Thank you so much, Dean. I think that's a very it's a very difficult question in a way, but I think it's also very simple because, as Robert said, that these people are coming for trade, they're coming for economics, and I don't think they really care about, and they have so many problems in their own backyard that I don't think they really care about Kashmir as much. And I don't have many hopes from these governments, but I do see that everyone does care about how they are seen and perceived on the global stage. And even though the Kashmiri diaspora, which formed this coalition against G20, they have been making some noise because Kashmiri people, as I keep saying, that they're not silent, they're silenced in this moment, and they haven't been able to protest and lodge their protest. They haven't been able to do the kind of protesting that had been used to, the grassroots protest. So in the moment, I think the coalitions across the global community, the Kashmiri diaspora across the globe, has been able to make some dent. For a newspaper to call it a diplomatic setback, for several countries to be revisiting and downgrading their participation from their country representatives to their local representatives inside India, sending them. They're still waiting on whether Egypt has, which is kind of like the strong ally in this moment for India. We're still kind of not clear whether they have registered or they are attending. I think Saudi Arabia, I mean, all of these countries have problems of their own, but at the same time, I do think being called a diplomatic setback for India, it means something to us. And this is an information war in this moment, because that's how modern battles are fought, have always been fought, but more so in this moment, it's very palpable. So I feel like that kind of work has been done. And Anna, when I said archives are being are being disappeared, they're being disappeared, like the journalistic work. But Kashmiri scholars in the last 20 years and Kashmiri writers and activists in the last 75 years have produced a lot of work that is out there and that needs to go out, and the rest of the world needs to read that. Having said that, this is not the only time that India, normalcy is an object for India. It really wants to, it's like a decorative piece that it wants to go and showcase to the rest of the world and curate it. Like, this is Kashmiri normalcy. It's a thing. When the siege was happening in 2019, the siege was still in effect. Kashmiris were under house arrest. All Kashmiris, the millions of population, they actually took a delegation to show them how normal Kashmir was. I mean, that's an irony in itself. And there were global representatives from different countries who went in to see the normalcy in Kashmir. It's a thing. I think they should have a monument inside Kashmir, which should be the normal Kashmir, and that's where they should go and come back, in some sort of a game. But that's kind of like the objectification of normalcy that has happened inside, and that goes within the subjectification of Kashmiri bodies. So we keep seeing this happening over and over. And it's going to happen more and more because Kashmir has opened Kashmir's veins. We have lithium mines that were discovered long back. But because I'm no fan of Article 370, because that was a Trojan horse that enabled India to do what it is doing along with the client politicians. But at the same time, the territorial sovereignty angle was very important. Not that Indians were not doing trade inside Kashmir or did not have properties inside Kashmir, but those properties were under lease. And they had like 100 years long lease to do those businesses and have those properties. But from 2019 onwards, now the veins inside Kashmir have been pried open, and there is no Kashmiri consensus on how to use the land, how to use the resources. And that kind of extractivism is happening. And I think I think that this kind of economic incursion that G20 is doing to show normalcy, but also to kind of like have real trade come in, is going to be a consistent effort that India does, but I don't think it's going to be as successful. In the last 3 years, they have been talking about this kind of an alliance, that economic alliance, this kind of investment coming inside Kashmir, but nothing is tangible on the ground because the situation is not really conducive. At the same time, we have to ask that, do we really want that kind of development into this fragile, ecologically fragile environment? Do we want those kind of industries inside Kashmir? So that's a question that we want to keep on asking the global community, which is kind of thinking of going into Kashmir. And I think UAE is doing some sort of alliance with India to go inside Kashmir, open some businesses. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. So yeah, that's my answer to this question. And Kashmir, as usual, it's like an onion. You peel one layer and then there's another, and then there's another, then there's another. So that's how India has gotten away with its settler colonialism thus far.
Thank you. Yes, one of the things that stood out to me that Anam said was that the burden of educating the world on what's happening in Kashmir keeps falling upon Kashmiris. And yet one of our audience members posed a very important question or comment that points out that Indian colonization, the colonization of Kashmir, includes the colonization of knowledge, such that Kashmiri researchers, scholars, and we also know journalists find it very difficult to get their work published or to get their work out into the world if it is in any way critical or opposing the narratives that India wants to project about Kashmir. And so I think there's a question of how do we confront those restrictions? And we know that journalists are either imprisoned or otherwise told to only write, kind of in some ways fluff pieces, things that are like, oh, what was the weather today in Kashmir? And all the issues that are happening on the ground seems to be have to be produced or at least published outside of Kashmir. Likewise, scholars or those who want to do research in Kashmir rarely are able to complete their research, or if they do, that they are not able to get it published, or if it's published, not get it circulated outside of Kashmir. So all of these layers. And so I'm wondering how we can think about that, that simultaneously the world is saying we need Kashmiris to tell the world about what's happening in Kashmir, and yet there's a very serious crackdown on Kashmiris being able to do so. What is a way that this can be pushed forward, or how can we kind of circumvent these restrictions in order to be sure that Kashmiris are able to get the word out, or there are other avenues that you think would be useful in order to kind of attend to these problems?
I can start, but I think, Ether, you had your microphone on. Did you want to start?
You go on, I can follow.
Okay. It's a very difficult situation. Journalists, of course, in Kashmir are arrested and killed. So there is that silencing there. But internationally, why aren't we, as the question said, why isn't there more scholarship published on the Kashmiri situation? I think what needs to be done is, as the question mentioned, there need to be independent Kashmiri journals. I don't know how one gets started, but I think that needs to be done. But also, I mentioned in my remarks similarities between the situation in Palestine, situation in Kashmir. And I think there might be merit in something that I hadn't thought about prior to today that I will do myself, is to submit articles about Kashmir to Palestinian journals that do exist, in the hopes that people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause will learn about what's going on in Kashmir, because as we've talked about today, a lot of people simply don't know what's going on in Kashmir. In the Indian narrative has been fairly successful in spreading the lies that India wants to hear. It is criminal, really, that there aren't journals that are focused solely on Kashmir, since so much is happening, so many people are suffering horribly. And the fact that some countries, India and Israel to name two, can get away with these crimes against humanity, these constant violations of human rights, constant violations of international law, is something that needs to be publicized, that needs to be addressed so that accountability can be held. So I personally would like to see Kashmiri journals, but until they are established, and if there's some way that I can assist in establishing them, someone let me know, then I would like to see submissions to other to journals that do support other oppressed peoples. And perhaps that is one way of starting to decolonize the knowledge about Kashmir.
Out did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I can. I think this is a specific question. I don't know if it's a specific question about how to get one's research published that I see in the Q&A. Kashmiri scholars are finding it impossible to get one's research published. Shouldn't there be dedicated journals publishing Kashmir work? There is an impetus on doing special issues and edited volumes. And, if someone wants to be a part of that, they can reach out and we can kind of help. I know that we're all kind of spread thin because we're all doing so many things. We have tried to, from time to time, invite people to write and, to collaborate. So while I see this question from the specific person, and I agree that there should be special issues and volumes, and there's already like a lot of forums that publish Kashmiri writing. So, but talking about academic journals, creating space. So I don't know how that would work, but we are trying to get special issues here and there and trying to do edited volumes and trying to do that kind of work. Having said that, the other aspect of it is, which is really in the last 3 years is coming to light, is really repression of Kashmiri writers. And we have in the past couple of years had to let go of some edited volumes and special issues where the writers retracted their writing because they did not feel safe in contributing that work. And on Kashmir Lit, which is the webzine that I have founded in 2008, in the last 3 years, there were many requests by people to take down even poetry, which is not overtly political, take down fiction. People have, they send requests day in and day out. They used to, but now it's kind of trickled down to, it's not that many requests. But what I did was, I actually published a symbolic empty page that kind of is symbolic for all the deleted writings, because Kashmiri writing in this moment is disappearing as well. And not just because they are deleting it, but because there is also a lot of self-censorship, because there's a lot of persecution. The dissent has been criminalized to an extent that India thinks everything that Kashmiris are writing is against its sovereignty. So that's also a problem. So that's kind of a problem that's palpable in the last 3 years. So while I respect the fact that we have to create places and forums for Kashmiri writing, and we should have an impetus on that, I'm also worried about people who have written and who are getting persecuted and retracting of writing, and we having to let go of projects because all the writers took back their writing. That had been our focus, to have like, let's say 12 writers from Kashmir publish in a special volume or an edited volume, and then at the last minute we had to let go of the entire volume because all the writers took their work back because they were in government jobs. They were getting government jobs, and background checks that are done in Kashmir, even if they find a little piece of dissent, they throw you out, and now their property is also under risk, because if they see dissent, they connect you to resistance, and then they might dispossess you of your property. So it becomes a huge thing. So that's what's kind of like stopping people. So maybe we can have a chat with the person who wrote the question about their specific writing, but these are my thoughts on kind of like what the general view right now is.
If I could just add something very quickly, I think because of that, because of the threats to Kashmiri writers, those of us who aren't Kashmiri have a greater obligation to publicize and make known what is happening in Kashmir.
Thank you. One question that seems to be coming up in a number of places in the from the audience is a question about Pakistan and China, and whether the Pakistani and Chinese occupations of Kashmiri territory are legitimate, and if not, why do we only talk about the Indian one? And I feel like this is a kind of opportunity to talk about, you know, how we are thinking about the overall situation in Kashmir, and that this is a question that's brought up in the international audience as well. Oh, this is a, you know, this is why it's said to be bilateral or trilateral or things like that. So how are we thinking about Pakistani and Chinese holding of Kashmiri territories, and vis-a-vis that happening in India, and whether we should consider these as equal things, or whether this is a question that is problematic itself? I'm wondering if you guys could respond to this.
I can jump in over here because I worked in Pakistan, administered Kashmir. Is it legitimate? No, of course not. But I do think that sometimes the danger is that there is an effort to create false equivalencies. And when these real challenges, as I was mentioning earlier, I mean, I've written about these, and they are really real challenges, because we have to understand that Kashmiris are living by the line of control. Whenever there is instability, whenever there is violence, right, a lot of that trickles in. There's firing across the line of control. The way the geography is, there are entire villages that are sandwiched in between army posts, right? You have an entire generation during the 90s in Neelam Valley who grew up in bunkers, who did not go to school. You have had hospitals being attacked with mortar shells. You have refugees who come in, escaped the violence in, you know, Indian-held Kashmir, and somehow made their way across and are still living in camps decades later, waiting to go back. So those very real challenges are there. I think the danger is when they are weaponized to create false equivalencies, which is what happens, and thereby it gets reduced to a tit for tat. There is a need to look across, look at the region, look at the challenges, look at those grievances, but we cannot draw those moral equivalencies.
So can I jump in? I do want to say, like, you know, when we think about the occupation, we have to understand that the Azad Kashmir side, those people actually won their independence from the fleeing Maharaja who they were fighting. At that time, they were called the, I forget the exact name, but they were called the Free Kashmir Forces, or something like that. And then they called the land that they freed Azad Kashmir, which means independent, free Kashmir. And that history completely gets negated. And when UN later comes in and puts this ceasefire line, the ceasefire line, which is now known as line of control, that was changed in 1971 without asking Kashmiris into line of control. So that was the ceasefire line, because the war was technically still going on between the two countries, with Kashmiris completely sidelined. But it is the truth, it's a historical fact that the Azad Kashmiris fought for their independence, fought for their freedom, and got a chunk of land freed from the Maharaja, and the rest was where the Indian army had swooped in and not annexed. Annexation was complete in 2019, but they had swooped in and started their military aggression in 1947. So we kind of need to consider those histories. So there is no, I don't think that there is an equivalence. And when people kind of like try to make India and Pakistan the same kind of aggressor, there is a definite historical difference. There is also what I say is an affective relationship with Pakistan that Kashmiris have, whether Kashmiris who want to accede to Pakistan, whether Kashmiris who do not want to accede to Pakistan but want to stay independent. They have an affective relationship with Pakistan, because we have to understand that Kashmir was, as Muhammad Junaid earlier said, it was Mulki Kashmir. It was ringed by mountains. It was it was called the emerald amongst pearls. and it had a geographical contiguity, what later became Pakistan in 1947. Kashmiris used to go study in Punjab. Many of our great-grandfathers, grandfathers have studied in the universities that are now what is Pakistan. And how is it possible that when the fleeing colonials, they decide that they're going to split the countries, split these territories into different countries, how is it that affects and emotions are going to flip overnight? So there is a connection between Kashmiris, there is a connection of trade, there was a connection of education, there was a connection of religion, most of all connection of culture. So I co-edited a book called Desolation Called Peace, which was actually targeting this very concept, because most of the India thinks that Pakistan is playing a proxy war, but they don't understand the sentiments of Kashmiris and their connections to Kashmir. Kashmiris used to eat, they used to have Kashmiri salt, Pakistani salt, which is known as the pink salt, not the Pakistani salt in Western countries. It's called the pink salt, but comes from Pakistani mines. Kashmiris used to favor using that salt because the trade linkages, even that fleeing Maharaja, his airport wasn't somewhere in Karachi because that's from where he flew. So he had a standstill agreement with Pakistan rather than India because India was refusing that. So all that history is completely negated, and now it's kind of made to be as if any kind of connection that Kashmiris share with Pakistan is a deviance, is being a traitor to India, and completely negating what Kashmiri identity is and how it's culturally an amalgam of how it has been, with its neighbors in the past. So that's something that needs to be considered. It's not just a proxy war. Kashmiris are not that kind of infantile people. They know who they are. So that's something that we have to consider, that we don't have to just think about Kashmir from 1989 onwards, from 1947 onwards. It's much before that you constitute this Kashmiri identity and then see its linkages to what is now Pakistan and to what is now India. It didn't have any connections to India because there are mountains in between what is Kashmir and India. And that's why India is blasting railways and tunnels into Kashmir at this moment, and kind of like having these highways built in. After it took away its autonomy in 2019, the next day, I think about 200 road projects and these building projects with the military and the BSF, which is the Border Security Force, were cleared without asking any advisory council, without asking any Kashmiri. So those kind of artificial linkages and communication projects are being created with India. So in this current moment, the entire history of the region with what is now Pakistan, with what is now Azad Kashmir, is completely annihilated, and it becomes very easy to call it Pakistan's proxy war and call the combatants from Azad Kashmir Pakistanis. That's also another erasure that happens of Kashmiri resistance movement.
Thank you, Athar. I know we're over time, so I wanted to ask one last question of our panelists before we close things up. And I'd like us to return again to the kind of present moment and the G20 meetings. One of the things that we talked about before is this desire to project that there's no need to worry about Kashmir, that everything is normal now, everything is fine, so on and so forth, as part, and on the one hand, because it is probably responding to participants' knowledge of Kashmir being considered this most dangerous place on earth, that it's this war-torn region, so on and so forth, so make it appear normal. But it also seems that another issue that might be on the mind of various participants is a concern over Hindu nationalism, that this is an issue that is on the minds of many members of the international community and the rise of Hindu nationalism. And yet there's a way in which talking about the rise of Hindu nationalism is spoken in totally different arenas from the Kashmir issues. And I was wondering if you could speak to how is it that Hindu nationalism is involved in the current situation in Kashmir? And how is it that the G20 meetings taking place is maybe functioning along the lines of addressing concerns over Hindu nationalism?
if I can start, Hindu nationalism is key to what's happening in Kashmir today, that the Modi government and Modi himself has been for decades a genocidal figure. He is responsible for the deaths of countless Muslims. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that the Hindu nationalist theory says that if someone is not a Hindu, then they're entitled to no rights. The only way they can gain any rights is by giving up their belief in Islam, becoming Hindu, converting to Hindu, and embracing everything. This is key to what's happening to the barbaric treatment of the Kashmiris and the barbaric treatment of Muslims throughout India, which seems to be on steroids in Kashmir, but it is a key issue. As far as again, getting back to the idea of normalcy, when the Hindu nationalism is sometimes talked about as a problem in international circles, it should be talked about much more. This is an opportunity possibly for India to say, no, see, it's not an issue at all. See how good things are here. So it does come into it, but I want to stress that it's key to the settler colonial project that India is operating in Kashmir.
Anam or Athar, would you like to jump in?
I'll just jump in quickly, and then Athar, maybe you can close us off if that's okay. Absolutely, I think it's integral to the project. I also think this Hindu nationalism is also not new. I think that it's very much been a work in progress. Even if we look at what was happening at partition within India, the narrative of partition is very much about Muslims breaking up the motherland and being disloyal to the Indian national project, essentially. And they've constantly faced the repercussions of that. So this Hindu nationalism has also been, it's an older project on steroids again. And I think what happens in Kashmir is very much symbolic of that project and of what it sees as its success again. So I think it feeds into what's happening in mainstream Indian politics right now, and how India wants to project itself in the otherization, the ghettoization of Muslims, which has a long history. And it's kind of being further exacerbated right now, and Kashmir has long kind of been subject to that Hindu nationalist settler project.
So there's several ways to answer this question. First, I would want to say that I did mention Jammu massacre, and I did say at that time that RSS was involved, and even the founder of RSS, Golwalkar, he actually came in, and he was trying to convince the Maharaja of what to do. And it's after that the massacre in Jammu happens. So there are the underpinnings of RSS and even what happens afterwards inside Kashmir to the client politicians at the behest of Hindu supremacists, so to speak, is also very telling of how deeply ingrained the Hindu supremacist elements are in kind of the annexation and annihilation of Kashmiri political desire. So that's one thing that we need to consider, that RSS is not a new player on the scene. And then early on, they had it in their manifesto. The BJP has always had, when BJP came into the way it's seen as BJP as the party, it was founded in, I think, 1991 or 292. But before that, they always had it on their manifesto that they have to do away with Article 370, because they kind of considered Kashmir to be not just part of the territory, but they're also kind of mythologizing it as part of the Hindu land. We have to understand that threat. So Kashmir is not only narrativized as which is the only Muslim-dominated or Muslim majority territory, but it's also kind of narrativized in BJP's and RSS's imaginary as a Hindu land, because Kashmiris in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, they turned to Islam, and kind of like hearkening back. And I think it's very important for us who are trying to think about Kashmir creatively that we do not, I personally have started not using the word partition, because partition is so much imposed on us, rather creation. Because when we say partitioning, we're also I feel like myself, this is for myself, I feel like we're kind of like also propagating this continuity of this India, that has kind of existed for the last 5,000 years, when in reality in 1947, the country you had was cobbled together by the British. And it was British India and princely states. It was not one country that was partitioned into two. It was creation of two countries based on a religion, and religion was kind of like central to both, even though India wanted to tell the rest of the world something else. And it was because of the leadership at that moment. But we know what that leadership did to Kashmiris, and how fundamentally Hindu that leadership also was, which was propagated by Nehru, but he was seen as a socialist. But now with what BJP is doing, is it's the neo-imperial, the supremacist heart, the fundamental heart, I don't know what else to call it, the ethno-nationalist heart of India coming to light in this moment. So I feel like it has always been a part of it. There is a video of an army officer reading a poem. It's a patriotic poem. It's kind of like, I forget what exactly it's called. It's called Veer Kavita or something like that. And he's actually talking about going up till Afghanistan, the original Gandhara, because that's kind of like seen as this mythic Hindu land. So that's something that we need to consider, that there are some serious ethno-nationalist elements in here that want to take over Kashmir, that want to change the demography, and they don't really care about how they look to the international community. There was a genocide alert that went out in 2019 when Kashmir was completely under siege, and India was calling it a lockdown, and the world was calling it a lockdown too. So, whereas Kashmiri scholars and activists, they were calling it a siege because that's what it was. No one really knew what was happening inside Kashmir. So this is a region under threat, and it's not like we're waiting for a genocide to happen. It's an incremental genocide, and a genocide that has already happened.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate you coming out to this event. I know we are well over our time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Robert, Anam, and Athar. Thank you so much for providing incredible insights today on the current G20 summit in Kashmir. In the chat are the calls to action for how you can move ahead and support responding to these G20 events and to get the word out about how it is functioning as a settler colonial moment. I also would like to thank our co-sponsors. It is incredible for you to step forward to support this work. And for those who are not able to see it, they are the Academics for Palestine Concordia, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights, Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir, SERAS, the South Asia Forum, Code Pink, Critical Diasporic South Asian Feminisms Collective, Free Kashmiri Political Prisoners, Friends of Sabeel North America, India Solidarity, Germany, Munich, International Defenders Council, International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India, Justice, Peace Advocates, Justice for All, Canada, Kashmir Law and Justice Project, Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network, Kashmir Palestine Scholars Solidarity Network, leftwingbooks.net, Palestinian and Jewish Unity, People's Health Movement United States, Project Accompagnement Solidarité Colombie, Punjabi Literary and Cultural Association Winnipeg, Quebec Public Interest Research Group Concordia, South Asia Solidarity Group, South Asian Diaspora Action Collective, Stand with Kashmir, the Polis Project, University Network for Human Rights, and World Beyond War. Thank you all so much for your sponsorship, and I hope we were all able to work together towards efforts for the Kashmiri community and to give a voice and power to those who are oppressed and held back and sidelined by these sorts of events and dynamics.